When police detectives entered Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment in Milwaukee in July 1991, they found one of the most horrifying and gory crime scenes ever. The refrigerator had a severed human head, and the freezer contained 2 additional heads and a torso. Dahmer had been a cannibal and active serial killer for 13 years. Even though his reign of terror was gone, these deeds were never forgotten. Many elements of his odd story continue to scare people today. 10 of his spookiest facts are listed below. Number 10. His fascination with sex and death dates back to his early years. On May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, the first child of Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, was born. 6 years later, his younger brother was born, completing the family. Even though their home appeared picture perfect to others, his mother attempted suicide by taking an excessive amount of drugs. His mother experienced extreme anxiety. In a report, Dahmer's first-grade teacher said she believed he was mistreated at home. According to his father, Dahmer's early fantasies about sex and death were inspired by roadkill. He stated, Jeffrey cut them open to look inside the creatures. He had intercourse with them, just like most young men do when their hormones are out of control. The future cannibal killer's cravings would not have become worse if these early warning signs hadn't been dismissed as teenage hormones. And I believe that Jeff was sort of hardwired after the neural connections, made touch. Number 9. His father showed him how to preserve corpses. Anyone familiar with Dahmer's actions will not be surprised to learn that as a youngster, he kept a collection of animal corpses in his clubhouse. When Dahmer was 4 years old, he started collecting animal bones and killing many of the creatures himself because he was interested in how they would fit together. His scientific father, who was struggling to connect with his estranged son, decided to demonstrate how to clean and preserve animal parts to pique the child's curiosity. This technique, which Dahmer had learned from his father, would later be used by him to preserve the body parts of his victims, which he kept in his own apartment. According to Malcolm Plant, the author of Making the Link, it is very likely that someone who abuses animals will also harm people. We discovered that not only had the majority of animal abusers experienced violence and abuse, but that this had also diminished their empathy and normalized their hostility. Number 8. His personality may have been changed by a childhood operation. Events in Dahmer's early years may have been the catalyst for his aggressive and nasty proclivities. Joyce Dahmer started taking medication for a health concern while pregnant with Jeffrey. Dahmer suffered limb issues right after birth and was confined to a wheelchair for 4 months. His mother's struggle with depression and the antidepressants she took did not improve her relationship with her little child because she soon quit breastfeeding. As a young adult, Dahmer also had treatment for many infections. Even though things finally got better, a 4-year-old Dahmer tragically needed surgery in 1964 to fix a double scrotal hernia. In her testimony at Dahmer's trial, clinical psychologist Dr. Judith Becker revealed details of some of her interactions with the murderer. In one, Dahmer recalls thinking that after the operation, his genitalia had been severed. After the operation, Dahmer's family also saw that he became reserved and timid. Growing up, Dahmer had few friends, which combined with his parents' lack of interest in him may have made him feel even more alone. These and other early experiences may have catalyzed Dahmer's troubling behavior later in life. Number 7. He committed his first murder at 18 years old. Dahmer's parents received a divorce in 1978 after each party accused the other of being excessively abusive and irresponsible. Former neighbor Susan Lear reported that during Dahmer's youth, the cops routinely showed up. He was going through a terrible circumstance when I first met him, and no one was there to help him. After the divorce, his mother and his younger brother moved out of town, and his father subsequently vacated the family home. Dahmer was abandoned. At the age of 18, he started binge drinking and committed his first murder. On June 18, 1978, he attracted hitchhiker Stephen Hicks back to the house, where he killed him by sledgehammering and strangling him. More than 10 years after Dahmer claimed to have dispersed the bones over his yard because the guy wanted to leave and I didn't want him to leave. Investigators were able to locate more than 500 bone fragments. Number 6. He allegedly raped soldiers in the military. Dahmer enrolled at Ohio State University 6 weeks after the murder of Stephen Hicks to major in business. But because of his drunkenness, he only received poor grades and left school after 3 months. His father then urged him to enlist in the United States Army in 1979. He obtained his medical training in the Army. 2 soldiers who were serving at the time of Dahmer's alleged drugging and rape have come forward. He was declared unfit for military service in 1981 and was discharged with honors. Preston Davis, a fellow military member who served with Jeffrey Dahmer at the same time, claimed Jeffrey had killed his first victim a year before joining the service, and he would get drunk in the barracks and say, "I killed the guy in Ohio," and we'd say, "You didn't kill anybody." Once he started drinking, he turned into a monster. He became a monster due to alcohol. Number 5. A victim count of 17. For Dahmer, there were a total of 17 victims. Since they were less likely to be reported missing right away, he would target men who were hitchhikers, drug dealers, or runaways. His grandmother's house's cellar served as the scene of the first killings. He would strangle his victims, keeping the body parts as mementos and taking pictures of the dismembered corpses. Even though she was ignorant of his actions, she soon became sick of his late-night drinking and ejected him. After that, he relocated to an apartment on North 25th Street in Milwaukee, where he continued to seduce his victims by offering them cash or illicit encounters. His number of victims increased from 4 to 17 in just 2 years. He later added, depersonalizing another person and viewing them as an object is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. A recreational item rather than a real, breathing human being. It appears to make it simpler to engage in improper behavior. Number 4. The foul-smelling apartment of horrors. Dahmer managed to avoid capture for so long, even though his neighbors slept only a few feet from where the serial killer was killing, dismembering, and cannibalizing the bones of his victims. Later, one of his neighbors referred to him as shy and a touch aloof to reporters. But it's not really strange. The smell then caught their attention. Among the body parts that Dahmer had wrapped in plastic bags and kept in the refrigerator for later use were hearts, biceps, and sections of leg tissue. Many serial killers collect mementos of their victims as trophies, according to Dr. Park Dietz, a forensic psychiatrist and consultant to the FBI Academy's Behavioral Science Unit. Identification cards or articles of clothing are sometimes used as trophies. However, few people are motivated by loneliness to save fragments of their victims' bodies. A normal serial killer would have the sense to try to hide the stench, the author continued. It would be really careless not to. Number 3. The disturbing and gruesome Polaroid collection. After killing a person, Dahmer would photograph the body as it was being dismembered. Additionally, he would place the body in horrifying poses while stating, "It was my way of remembering their attractiveness, their physical beauty. At the very least, I could have their skeletons there with me if I couldn't keep them whole." A small boy was spotted running naked down the street on May 26, 1991, and Dahmer's neighbor reported the incident to the authorities. When the police arrived, Dahmer was able to persuade them that the 19-year-old youngster was his boyfriend and was intoxicated. The officers essentially handed the victim back to the serial killer by leaving the young teenager with Dahmer because they didn't want to get involved in a homosexual domestic quarrel. Then, on July 22, 1991, Tracy Edwards arrived drunk and bound at the wrist. The police decided to search Dahmer's apartment after learning that a strange person had shackled him. One of the officers began pursuing the obscene assortment of Polaroid pictures. He found jars holding genitalia and other body parts in the fridge of horrors. It was more like disassembling someone's museum than an actual crime scene, the chief medical examiner said. Number 2. His twisted zombie experiment. Prosecutors sought Dr. Frederick Fosdal, a forensic psychiatrist, to evaluate Dahmer. He discovered that the serial killer had performed lobotomies on several of the bodies of his victims, making holes in their skulls and injecting fluid there. He gave them a muriatic acid injection while they were still alive to see if he could control them. He wanted to manage them and keep them around longer by turning them into zombies, according to Fosdal. He acknowledged having sex with some of the bodies and freezing one man's heart for later eating. They weren't inhumane, sadistic acts, according to Fosdal. He said he had killed them in the least painful way he knew how. Everything revolves around the control problem. The psychiatrist's inquiry also turned up no proof to support Dahmer's defense of insanity. It was clear that Dahmer knew his actions were immoral, but nonetheless carried out the terrible murders. A jury found Jeffrey Dahmer guilty of first-degree murder in February 1992, and they also gave him a 15-year life sentence. Number 1. He was beaten to death behind bars. At Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution, Dahmer and 2 other inmates were given a labor assignment early on November 28, 1994. They were not being watched. Christopher Scarver, a 6'3" prisoner who started asking Dahmer about his murders against African Americans because the bulk of Dahmer's victims were of that race, was one of those detainees. Following the argument, Scarver killed Dahmer by striking him with a steel rod from a piece of exercise equipment. Additionally, he attacked Jesse Anderson, the second man. En route to the hospital, Dahmer passed away from his injuries, and Anderson passed away 2 days later. Later, Scarver admitted that he had been imprisoned in isolation for the killings for 16 years. When questioned why he killed Dahmer, he explained that the serial murderer would play with his food, sculpting it like dismembered limbs, then pour ketchup over it to make it look like blood to torment the other prisoners. He further asserted that Dahmer was left unattended because the jail personnel wanted him dead. Dahmer passed away when he was 34 years old.